stage with this paper, which is very much evolving. So I wanted to start out by thanking the organizers of this conference and express my deep appreciation and gratitude for being here with all of you. What I'm going to present to you today are some very new thoughts about a fairly new topic, which is sketchy and speculative, and I appreciate having the opportunity to think through it with all of you. You might think of this presentation as engaging specifically Joffrey's question from the workshop description. As scientists study distant spaces and global processes, how do their findings transform our understanding of what it means to be in the world? How do inquiry and insight change our outer space imagination and the way we comprehend Earth on a whole planetary scale? With the additional specificity of how does the search for habitable and inhabited worlds transform and become transformed by our understanding of what it means to live on a living planet in the context of climate crisis and mass extinction? How might the relationship between atmospheres and planetary habitability constitute a collective project around which astronomers, geoscientists, anthropologists, and historians, such as we are in the room, can assemble? In his 1938 essay, The Age of the World Picture, philosopher Martin Heidegger argued that an intrinsic characteristic of modern science and modernity more broadly is the impulse to form an increasingly precise world picture. What is a world picture, Heidegger asks. His groundbreaking definition, obviously, a picture of the world. But what does world mean here, he goes on. What does picture mean? As Heidegger elaborates, world serves as a name for what is in its entirety. Whereas by picture, he meant something along the lines of a depiction or representation of an idea or matter at hand, as suggested with the colloquialism, to get the picture. In his terms, a picture means that the matter stands before us exactly as it stands with it for us. Clear enough. More than just a copy, a world picture is a way of making the whole world stand before us in representation, precisely as we experience it with us, in our being within it. A picture aims to set out what is in its entirety by means of what can be presented as it is for us. A byproduct of making the world into picture, then, was to delimit what counts as being in existence by what can be experienced empirically with the human at the center of this project. And this is Heidegger again. Only that which becomes an object in this way, that is through natural or historical representation, is considered to be in being. Hence, world picture, he goes on, when understood essentially, does not mean a picture of the world, but the world conceived and grasped as picture. We can think of Heidegger's notion of a picture as not something necessarily pictorial in the photographic sense, but a kind of a gigantic representational system of information and interrelation, something like an archive or a database. But the rub for Heidegger is that when making the world into an increasingly legible and detailed picture through calculations and recordings and inscriptions of data, the thing in itself, that is, the world as picture, becomes a kind of unruly object and takes on the character of the incalculable. This incalculability, Heidegger concludes, becomes the invisible shadow cast over all things when man has become the subjectum, a Latin term meaning underlying thing, and world has become picture. Despite the work of modern science, in Heidegger's terms, toward a kind of complete mastery of the world through calculation, the byproduct of an expanding world picture was an even larger looming shadow of incalculability hovering above, the site for a modern metaphysics. So, though this essay was written in 1938, Heidegger went on to live until 1976, during which some will recall he became an active member of the Nazi Party, went through the process of denazification from which he emerged fairly unscathed, and lived the last years of his life during the heyday of the spacers. One might not be surprised to learn that when Heidegger encountered in 1966 the first pictures of Earth from lunar orbit, he lamented, "This is no longer the Earth on which man lives." One cannot help but also think here, as historian Benjamin Lazier points out, of the moment just 2 years later, exactly 30 years after Heidegger wrote the world picture, when the first set of human eyes regarded Earth and its hemispherical, what would be the quarter of the Earth? order spherical totality and exclaimed, "Look at that picture over there." I have often wondered myself more recently what Heidegger would think of an entirely different kind of picture that has been making the rounds on pop science news sites of late. Many of you, I imagine, will have seen it, and if not, you can probably guess what it is. It's the Earth. Or rather, it is a speculative construction of what the Earth might look like were it to be spotted by one of the upcoming direct imaging missions. Using high-res images from NOAA's Discover satellite, which has in its lifetime amassed a database of over 30,000 images of Earth taken every half hour continuously over the last 3 years, the author of this image, astronomer Stephen Kane, reduced an immensely detailed world picture down to just 9 pixels. While I imagine Heidegger would have been appalled at the very idea of the Discover mission, I like to think he might have been a bit more optimistic about what these 9 pixels present to us as the matter as it stands with it and for us, that is, of the world as spectrum. Even if he wouldn't be, I am, and in the remainder of this talk I hope to convey to you why. If Heidegger presaged one of the defining images of the 20th century, the world as picture, how might we then move to understand what it means to think the world as one of these pictures? Here I want to propose that we might think of this world picture, if we want to call it that, as offering an opportunity for the formation of a new alliance. More specifically, I'm suggesting that a joint project might begin to form between the planetary sciences and the anthropology of being and becoming around the study of atmospheres and their relation to their relation to the enabling conditions of and constraints on life itself. This joint inquiry can be thought of as engaged specifically in the making of the atmosphere into what Bruno Latour terms a matter of concern, a concept which Latour incidentally models off of Heidegger's notion of the thing as something that gathers or assembles. I propose here that the study of atmospheres might be such a matter of concern of which anthropologists and astronomers can assemble around. Atmosphere is what enables us to ask simultaneously, what does the relation between life and non-life, between emergent biotic forms and planetary conditions and constraints, tell us about the world and about being in the world? How does atmosphere help us think about the potentialities and precarities of life on a planet and how we navigate our own lives within it? So in the rest of this talk, I want to consider ways in which both anthropology and exoplanet astronomy have taken up the atmosphere as a vehicle for considering the relationship between a planet and the emergence and maintenance of life itself, which, thank you, Boris, for your beautiful elaboration of some of those concepts, which I am sure to butcher, but will be humorous nonetheless. And I then end by way of a provocation for how we might think atmosphere as an object and as a matter of concern going forward. That's not the slide I thought was next, but that's okay. What is a habitable world? Yeah, I meant this one. If you ask Martin Heidegger, he would probably say a world that is habitable. But if you ask an astronomer, they'll likely tell you something closer to this. A habitable world is, at minimum, a terrestrial planet with stable liquid surface water. Simple as it sounds, a lot goes into determining where and how a planet can maintain liquid surface water. First, a planet should have the right surface temperature and pressure, and surface gravity, I think, also, which I should add to that, which I believe correspond roughly to the distance from the host star and the size of the planet. The region surrounding the host star are thought to lend itself most closely to these conditions, as Boris touched on, based off of the amount of thermal radiation Earth receives from the sun, has been called the habitable zone. And another important determination, and not wholly unrelated to the concept of the habitable zone, is whether a planet has an atmosphere and what its composition and structure is. In the most basic sense, no atmosphere equals no liquid water. The two are coterminous, in my understanding. Though there are many other considerations for what geophysical features are needed as conditions for life, it seems that they all fall secondary to the presence of an atmosphere. On the other hand, an inhabitable world is obviously a world that is inhabited. Without having the ability to observe life directly, the main way exoplanet astronomy has imagined determining the presence of extraterrestrial life is through the detection of biosignature gases within a planet's atmosphere. A biosignature is defined as an object, substance, and/or pattern whose origin specifically requires a biological agent. In exoplanet astronomy, currently thought biosignatures that are currently being considered include oxygen, ozone, nitrous oxide, methane, ammonia, methyl chloride, sulfur gases, and haze. The field of biosignatures is fraught with complexities and debates, potential false positives and negatives, to the point that some argue that biosignatures will always be haunted by the possibility of being explained by non-living processes. What looms in the background of both of these methods for considering extraterrestrial life is the remaining lack of consensus on what life is. That's not what's supposed to be next either. That's okay. Rather than seeing this as undermining the search for life, however, I like to think that the techniques we are using to find life themselves give us insight into what we imagine life to be. In the most general sense, what these techniques underscore, I think, is the necessity for thinking life as an emergent property of non-life and as something that occurs on and in relation to a planet. By way of a translation into the language of anthropology, we might say that life occurs in the intermediary space between latent geophysical and atmospheric conditions of possibility and atmospheric traces of inhabitation, akin to what Elizabeth Pavanelli describes as a kind of dialectical unfolding of life out of and back into non-life. Though this has certainly not given us any kind of quantitative guide to thinking life, what it has revealed, I think, is a necessary relation between a particular kind of unfolding of a planet that we value very much and the spherical enclosure, the atmosphere, that potentiates it, sustains it, and moreover communicates its presence to us. When we move to think about the atmospheres in anthropology as a kind of vital enclosure that sustains multi-species ecologies, we also come to understand the ways in which they can morph into constricting containers of unlivable conditions. This has had, I think, immense relevance for anthropologists interested in working on the Anthropocene and the rendering of the world unlivable through destructive practices now collected under the umbrella term global change. Anthropologists of many stripes have taken up through the notion of the atmosphere a certain ethnographic orientation to the air that traces out the relation between toxic atmospheres, or mutant ecologies, as one project at UChicago termed it, and our current political historical moment. Notions of air, weather, and atmosphere have proven particularly generative for thinking through relationships between mining, toxic exposure, and structural violence, between nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and nuclear fallout, between chemtrails and conspiracy theorists, and between breathability, anti-blackness, and settler colonialism. We see this, for instance, in a recent collection of essays in cultural anthropology on the subject of chemoethnography, in which particles operate as techniques for mapping new political and social geographies of toxicity and endurance. What does it afford us to move from thinking chemically, as the authors describe in the introduction, to thinking atmospherically? Here we might follow another anthropologist, Timothy Choisley, when he points us to looking at an atmosphere as a kind of space of distribution, in which he writes, "Distribution in an atmospheric key begins from a reckoning with how things lift off, move, or settle. Tracking agitations, suspensions, and sedimentations, following condensations when enough of something collects around a speck to precipitate, and noting how microsubstances attach to, become, or catalyze something else." The opportunity and the challenge for anthropology here, I think, is to move beyond the metaphoric language and think about this as a material condition as well. So I want to conclude by suggesting that if Martin Heidegger was thinking about the world picture as a fundamental relation to our being in the world in a contemporary moment, that we might think about this current image that exoplanet science is offering us as a way to think about our relationship to the world, specifically through the atmosphere. And I'd like to conclude again by way of speculation on what kind of peculiar object the atmosphere is and how we might think of it together going forward. With apologies to Joffrey for my most jargony sentence of the talk. This is inspired by Heidegger as well as my recent readings of philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, saying, an atmosphere is not an object, but a vital space of enclosure that clears a space for the history of being to unfold. I think I'll just end it there.
Okay, one question. If nobody, I'm happy to ask something myself. Being an anthropologist working with astrobiologists, I'm kind of aware about the way that both sort of types of researchers deal with the atmosphere. So in anthropology, there's a lot of debate on the atmosphere or using the atmosphere to theorize all kinds of things. The same thing happening, well, something similar happening in astrobiology, but when I compare the two, I tend to find the way anthropologists do it much more limited, constricted in many ways, in the sense that they always tend to sort of start from a quite traditional definition of the atmosphere. Well, the astrobiologists, when you look at the planet Venus already, so what do you have there? Is it an ocean or a very thick atmosphere? And then that sort of brings them, okay, here on Earth, is there one atmosphere? Or could you see our oceans also as a very specific type of very thick atmosphere? Is the soil where we stand on, is that just a very sort of extreme atmosphere? So where does that end? So that's kind of interesting to see, something the anthropologists totally ignore in their discussions. They always sort of take the more sort of dictionary definition of the thing. So I'm not sure what I'm going to ask, but I think, yes, if you're interested in Heidegger and philosophy, it might be worth to look at what astrobiologists do. I mean, they don't have the pretension to be philosophers, but what they're doing is actually incredible. The conceptual kind of stretching and things they do. So I don't just give that to you as a comment.
Well, maybe if I could just tag on one thing, I think on the same note of the slightly different imagination of atmosphere. So excellent astronomers that I was working with who were just at the very beginning of modeling, because this was 10 years ago, 9 years ago. I was really struck because at that moment they were referring to atmosphere as gas envelope. That was for a long time the language being used. So I kind of in some sense, it's this interesting move of making strange the familiar, right? To call it a gas envelope, which maybe allows for that expansive imagination that you've encountered in astrobiologists. So yeah, again, just another kind of comment to tag onto yours.
I think what is important in this case is not only philosophers try to reshape a concept to describe reality, so scientists, anthropologists, and in some cases you can give a new empirical basis for one concept, and in other cases so the concepts such as habitability can be an obstacle for clear understanding of the situation. So I think in all the cases we got this necessity to engage philosophical reflection of the category we are using. And it's very important.
Okay, so thank you very much.